Good Wednesday morning to you. From Telesur, I'm Regan Devines in Caracas, Venezuela. Thank you for being here with us on From the South. This morning we start in Russia, where the Upper House of Parliament has unanimously approved President Vladimir Putin's request for deployment of military forces abroad. Russia will use their air force to bomb Islamic State group targets in Syria with no troops on the ground. According to Putin's Chief of Staff, Sergei Ivanov, they will notify the U.S. of all airstrikes through an intelligence gathering center in Iraq's capital, Baghdad. He explained that the decision by Parliament was made in response to a request from Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. He also said that the Russian airstrikes will be in line with international law because they were invited to do so by Syria. This in contrast with the U.S.-led airstrikes, which are being carried out with absolute disregard to the country's sovereignty.
The operation will only include the Russian Air Force. As our president said, the use of land forces is excluded.
Argentina's President Cristina Fernandez attended the UN's 70th General Assembly for the last time while in office. In her speech, she pointed out the need for world powers to comply with international law. Our correspondent in Buenos Aires, Laureano Ponce, has those details.
The President of Argentina, Cristina Fernandez, attended the 70th session of the United Nations General Assembly on Monday. In her last speech at the UN while in office, Fernandez criticized the financial establishment and the U.S. foreign policy while highlighting the improvements Latin America has achieved under progressive governments.
Latin America had been the icon of inequality, but thanks to the economic growth achieved by the popular and democratic governments that some like to call populist, we have improved access to healthcare, education, housing to millions. Today we can say we are a growing continent.
This was the last time that Fernandez attended the Assembly as Argentina's head of state, as her current term in office ends in December. Experts point out that her participation in the UN in previous years had always been focused on reinforcing Latin American sovereignty while confronting global powers.
Cristina Fernandez always spoke against war, against arms buildups, against the international financial powers, and this year she did it in a moment when the General Assembly is developing and recovering multilateralism, which have been left behind.
The 70th General Assembly took place only 2 weeks after an Argentine initiative to establish a legal frame for debt restructuring processes was approved by the body, which is considered by many as one of the most important resolutions adopted by the UN in recent years.
It was a great achievement, with a very important role played by Argentina and Bolivia, but it was essentially a return of the third world views of the Asian, African and Latin American countries, and even with the support of some European countries.
The President of Argentina also added that a world where 1% of the population owns 50% of the wealth is not sustainable and called for wealth distribution policies in order to build more equal society. Laureano Ponce, Telesur, Buenos Aires.
Cuban President Raul Castro met with his colleague, President Barack Obama, for the first time on U.S. soil. They spoke about the normalization of relations between Washington and Havana, an historic process that was announced last December. After the meeting, Castro said that Havana remains committed to building a new type of relationship with Washington, one that is based on the respect of the other's sovereignty. But he again reiterated that relations to be fully normalized, the U.S. needs to lift the 54-year-old blockade on the island nation, among other things.
The Cuban president ratified Cuba's willingness to work in order to build a new type of relation between Cuba and the United States based on respect and sovereign equality. The blockade still persists. The pace of the process towards normalization will depend on the lifting of the blockade.
And that was Cuba's Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez, who also insisted that the U.S. must return Guantanamo Bay to Cuba and compensate Cubans for the economic effects of the blockade, which it turns out has cost the Caribbean country over $830 billion. He announced that Havana would once again present a resolution to the UN's General Assembly next month condemning the blockade. He also said that Cuba should have never been put on the US list of sponsors of terrorism.
Cuba has historically been a victim of terrorism. 3,478 Cubans were assassinated as part of a terrorist action, mostly organized from United States territory. 2,099 Cubans have been maimed permanently as a result of terrorist acts. We appreciate the just decision of the United States government to exclude Cuba from our list of countries that sponsor international terrorism, in which Cuba should never have been placed.
Now we visit Peru, where one of the several active social conflicts involving foreign companies in the extractive sector is a case in which children are the most visible victims of contamination. Our correspondent Rael Mora is there in Lima. He filed this story.
Maria de la Cruz lives in the district of Simón Bolívar in the region of Pasco in central Peru, which is heavily contaminated by mining activity. Her daughter is one of over 2,000 children who have not developed normally due to significant presence of minerals in their body, such as cadmium, arsenic, and lead.
My daughter was born, well, fine. She walked, and from one moment to the other, her head started hurting. Her stomach was upset. Then she had pain in her bones. She was always throwing up and had diarrhea, and a big headache. Even now, her head hurts and she has eczema. Practically half of her body is dead.
Maria and her daughter, together with 56 other residents of Simón Bolívar, will make the 15-day march to the capital of Lima to raise awareness of the situation and demand the government to implement a plan based on a resolution it approved 3 years ago.
This resolution was passed with the goal of saying, all right, I already did what I had to do for you, now you go see what to do. And it should not be like that. This resolution had to be followed just as it prescribes, simply the way it's needed, and the Ministry of Finance has to provide the economic funding for it. Without funds, these resolutions are not viable.
The 2012 resolution followed independent studies showing 60% of the children in the district were contaminated. It declared Simón Bolívar in an environmental emergency, and it included a plan with 32 steps to improve the situation, but no solution has been reached, and the victims are left in a desperate situation. Rael Mora, Telesur, Peru.
Still in Peru, 3 protesters were shot dead and over 20 were wounded in clashes with police due to a Chinese-Australian mining project worth over $7.4 billion. The mining project, which is run by Minerals and Metals Group Limited, MMG, has sparked controversy in Peru with the construction of a massive copper mine near the highland town of Chalhuacho. Protesters are demanding that the company improve its environmental plan and hire more locals. Peru is facing various anti-mining protests over environmental concerns, which have all erupted in violence, leaving at least half a dozen people dead. And now we give you a look at other stories making news across the globe.
Despite various appeals for clemency, including one by Pope Francis, Kelly Gissendaner became the first woman to be executed in the U.S. state of Georgia in 70 years. She was executed by lethal injection just after midnight. Prison officials said Gissendaner was sentenced to death for her role in plotting the killing of her husband in 1997. Kelly was the 16th woman to be executed since the U.S. reinstated the death penalty in 1976.
She apologized for what she did. She said she was sorry that that amazing man lost his life because of her. And once after the execution started, she began singing Amazing Grace and sang it all the way through.
Saudi-led coalition against Yemen killed 131 innocent civilians that were attending a wedding. This brings the number of civilian casualties in Saudi-led airstrike to over 2,300 in 6 months. The UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon strongly condemned the attack. Ban said any attack on civilians is in violation of international law and must be investigated. Saudi Arabia began their attacks on Yemen in March after the Houthi rebels ousted the Saudi-backed government.
This crime, this unspeakable cruelty. I say to Salman, what are the goals of this strategy of striking a wedding tent with women and children? What are the goals of striking women and children? The casualties have now risen to 131, and now all the people will follow Ansarullah.
Violence between Israeli forces and Palestinians has again erupted. The Israeli army fired tear gas at youth in an attempt to disperse them. The Palestinians responded by hurling rocks. No injuries or arrests were reported. The Russian news agency RAPLI reported that clashes also broke out in the West Bank cities of Hebron and Bethlehem. Israeli Sancher's ally, United States, has said it was deeply concerned about the Israeli violence against Palestinians, but called on all sides to exercise restraint. Israeli forces also carried out an airstrike on the Gaza Strip. They claimed the attack was in response to rockets fired by Palestinian militants into southern Israel. According to military officials, the rocket was shot down by a missile defense system. They replied with 4 overnight airstrikes. No injuries or damages were reported. Last year, Israel attacked Gaza throughout 51 days, killing over 2,500 people, most of whom were civilians, including women and children. They also caused over $5 billion in damages.
Finally this morning, Mexican striker Javier Chicharito Hernandez played well for Leverkusen in the Champions League game against Barcelona. He almost scored once, but his shot was blocked in a spectacular save by Barcelona's goalie, Ter Stegen. He later missed 2 other opportunities before being substituted 54 minutes into the match. However, Luis Suarez and Sergio Roberto scored with about 10 minutes left in the game to win with the final score of 2-1. Both teams will face off again on December 9th.
We cannot forget which team we are playing. Probably the best team in the world alongside Bayern Munich. Even when Messi is not playing, Barcelona is a great team that does things very well.
For more on these and other stories, please visit our website, telesurtv.net/English. For Telesur English, I'm Regan Devines. We'll have another news brief for you just after midday. Have a great morning.